So Timothy Bradley is back at it again with another one of his takes. This time, the controversy surrounding his opinions on Crawford versus Canelo. Now, I've already previously made a video on my opinions on what would happen in the fight and my rationale for why I think Canelo would win that bout. But since that video, a lot of different things have transpired. For one, Terence Crawford had the Madrimov fight, and we got to see a lot more of a human in Crawford. He wasn't looking as supernatural as he was in the 147-pound division versus how he's looking now at 154. The other thing we were able to witness was Canelo's performance against Berlanga in September. While neither of those opponents would offer a stylistic comparison for Crawford or Canelo, I think it's important to look at what caused both fighters to struggle in each one of those bouts. So in the case of Crawford, it was clear that the size of Madrimov was giving Crawford issues. The other part of it too was that, not that Crawford's power wasn't carried up to 147, but the guys at 154 are a lot bigger, and so they're able to absorb much more of the damage that Crawford would be able to dish out. And then when it comes to Canelo's performance against Berlanga, so he was fighting a younger fighter, of course, with much less experience than himself and Crawford. But I think one of the things to note here that was interesting was the fact that Canelo is still able to put down fighters. A criticism that everyone seems to have for Canelo lately is that he's not getting rid of his opponents. And yes, he's fighting fights that we don't necessarily want to see him in, right? Like the Charlo fight, the Ryder fight, Munguia, Triple G3, etc. So while he's not necessarily getting the knockouts that he used to, he's still doing the type of damage to have his opponents on the canvas. And in these last few fights, he's been the first person to put some of these fighters down. He was the first one to put Munguia down. He was the first person in a while to have Charlo down. Berlanga has been dropped before, but not in the way that Canelo did it. So the first statement that Timothy Bradley said was that Crawford would just steamroll Canelo and that fight would be easy. I personally don't see how that's even in the cards. No matter which perspective you take on this fight, Crawford is going to have a hard time dealing with Canelo. And I find it interesting that Tim Bradley put out a video kind of clarifying his statement, saying that Crawford would outbox Canelo. And he uses fights like Bivol and like Mayweather and like Lara as evidence as to why Crawford would be able to outbox him. I find it interesting, and I don't know if this is like a thing for boxers or boxing or what the case is, but I find it interesting that people have to reach towards a fight that happened over a decade ago that was at a weight that wasn't Canelo's natural weight class. Like, Canelo was 152 pounds and 23 years old when he fought Mayweather. He wasn't in his prime when it came to his power or his speed or his IQ, so it's like, yes, he did get outboxed by Mayweather, but so has everyone else. And not just that, but it was a younger version of Canelo. The fact that people refer to a fight that happened such a long time ago as if nothing transpired after, as if Canelo didn't go on to like become undisputed, go up another 3 weight classes to win multiple titles. It's almost as if none of this happened between him fighting Mayweather and present day. So I think it's weird that they refer to those fights. The other weird thing is that Timothy Bradley used the fact that Bivol was able to out-jab Canelo as a reason why Crawford would be able to do so. Yeah, Crawford has a long reach. He has a longer reach than Canelo. He has a long jab. But Bivol's jab was accompanied by power and footwork and IQ as well, and he's a much bigger fighter than Canelo is. And even though Canelo wasn't winning the fight, he was still being able to do some type of damage. The issue with Crawford is that we can say what we want about Crawford training with heavier fighters or perhaps sparring with heavier fighters when he's in camp. But the truth of the matter is those are different sized gloves, there's headgear involved, and even Bivol was able to feel the power of Canelo. And the issue with that is you're comparing a 175-pounder that was able to take the power of someone that's smaller than them, and you're using that logic and applying it towards a fighter that came up from 135 to be able to do the exact same thing to a fighter that has now, completely adapted their body to the 168-pound division, which just seems pretty ridiculous to me. It's like, okay, if that's the case, can Crawford go in and beat better Biev as well? Because a lot of people think that Bivol beat better Biev. So it's these little topics that I find interesting, because I think we're taking the rational portion out of this and looking at it from a fantasy perspective. Now, one point that Timothy brought up that I think is actually a pretty decent one is the fact that we just witnessed Usyk beat Fury and there was a huge size discrepancy there. The only difference is that Canelo has proven time and time again that he is also at an all-time great level. He hasn't needed the media or or boxing pundits or a specific network to drive up his stock in the way that Fury has. We saw Fury struggle with an MMA fighter in Ngannou. We've never seen Canelo struggle with a fighter of that level. We also saw Fury struggle with a Wilder who, let's be honest, only had punching power with that right hand. We've never seen Canelo struggle with a fighter that only had one asset. It had to be a fighter with a high IQ, with great footwork, with constant pressure. And so I don't see why that comparison of Usyk and Fury would apply here to Crawford and Canelo. For one, I think it's kind of disrespectful that Canelo is kind of always regarded to as just somebody who's a knockout puncher. He punches hard, but he's not a knockout puncher. He's a boxer. If anything, he's a boxer puncher, even a counter puncher, if you will. A lot of his knockouts come from perfectly timed shots. And in that Berlanga fight that I was referring to, that left hook that dropped Berlanga was extremely fast. Now, of course, Crawford might not get caught by that exact punch, but the fact that Timothy Bradley thinks that the only way that Canelo would even have a chance is if he bulldozes him makes no sense, because Canelo has shown that his timing makes up for what he lacks in foot speed and agility overall. And I've heard a lot of fighters say this, like after they fight Canelo. They say he's a lot faster than I expected. And it's one thing to see a fight from the outside and say, oh, it's a little bit slower. Obviously, the lighter weight classes that Crawford was fighting in, the guys would be faster. But once you're in there, in that ring, carrying that weight, a lot of different factors come into play. One of the things that never gets mentioned is the fact that Crawford will probably not carry the same speed and agility if he fights at 168. If he decides to come in at a lower weight, let's say 160, and not bulk up to the full 168, then that, might help him keep his agility and all that, but it might affect his ability to withstand a punch. So it's like there's two sides to every coin, and for every kind of argument that you try to make for Crawford potentially having a benefit in this fight or some kind of factor that would counteract Canelo's, you have a counter for it, if that makes sense. So I guess if I were to give you guys a top 5 reasons on why I think Canelo would beat Crawford, I'd start off with taking a look at maybe 5 different aspects of this potential fight. So one is size and power. So when it comes to size and power, I think it's pretty clear who is, the bigger, stockier, bulkier fighter. It's going to be Canelo. When it comes to power, I think they're both pretty strong. I think Crawford's wrestling background will actually play a key role in this fight when it comes to the inside game. But overall, it's going to be a night and day difference. I mean, even Bivol said that Canelo hit just as hard as Beterbiev. And I understand that that's Canelo loading up on all his shots, but I'm pretty sure that's going to be the approach he takes when fighting Crawford. So when it comes to size and power, we have to give the edge to Canelo. When it comes to experience against elite fighters, we obviously have to give that to Canelo too. I mean, with Crawford, yes, he's become undisputed in 2 different weight classes, but the 140-pound division, and again, not taking any credit away from Crawford because that accomplishment is a great accomplishment that a lot of fighters will never be able to do, but the competition at 140 wasn't that great. When it came to 147, as previously mentioned in other videos, he really only had to fight Jeff Horn and Errol Spence. So a lot of people had Errol Spence in their personal pound-for-pound lists, but if we're all being honest with each other and looking at the situation, he was damaged goods by that point. And again, I think Crawford would have won that fight regardless of when they would have fought. But the truth of the matter is, that fight will kind of always have an asterisk to some of the audience. And removing that asterisk in general, I mean, how many fighters has Canelo fought that have been considered elite? I mean, a lot of people like to disregard that little Euro tour that he went on, but Callum Smith had won that tournament that we give Andre Ward praise for, right? He had won that Super 6 that was done. Billy Joe Saunders was considered to be one of the more slick fighters, as was Caleb Plant. Triple G has always given everyone problems, but when he entered the ring with Canelo, all of a sudden he became regular. Which I think, as the face of boxing, you should have that criticism against you, right? You should be the one driving the sport forward. So it makes sense why people would criticize you a lot heavier. But if we're being completely transparent, the names that I just mentioned that often get labeled as, cherry picking, those would be the best fighters on your favorite fighter's resume. Benavidez got a lot more credit fighting Plant than Canelo got for fighting Plant. Even though when Canelo fought Plant, he was an undefeated and had never touched the canvas before. With saying that though, it's clear that the competition, the big fight level experience is going to go towards Canelo as well. When it comes to age, this is probably where, ironically, I'll give Crawford the benefit of the doubt. Crawford is older than Canelo by 2 or 3 years, but the truth of the matter is Crawford hasn't had as much wear and tear and as many camps as Canelo. While Crawford did have, some minor amateur experience, a lot of his fights have been, as a professional. And while he does have a pretty sizable amount under his belt, I think he's like 41 fights in at this point, he hasn't necessarily had the tough fights that Canelo has had. The truth is, we've seen Canelo become better before our very eyes, right? We saw him take some of the slickness from the Mayweather and Lara fights. We saw him, with his head movement improvements when it came to the Daniel Jacob fights. And we saw him be able to adjust a little bit more with the Triple G fights. And so while Canelo wasn't the perfect product, I would say, that Crawford was when he first entered, Canelo has shown that hard work, has amassed him this level of experience and boxing IQ where he's able to compete with anyone on an elite level. And with that, comes a lot of wear and tear. He's been in a lot of grueling fights. He's obviously had injuries that we're all aware of at this point. And I think that the fact that Crawford hasn't been in the ring with as much competition, at this high level, has kind of preserved him a little bit. But on the flip side, right, that also means, as I referred to earlier, he doesn't have that same level of experience at this stage. But from my point of view, and this is probably going to be the only subjective part here, I don't think Crawford needs that experience, if that makes sense. Like, when he's in front of the crowd, like that Errol Spence fight could be considered his biggest fight ever. It's not even should be considered, it is his biggest fight ever. He completely didn't let the crowd get to him. He fought that fight in the way he needed to fight it, and he showed that even under that immense amount of pressure, he's able to handle it well. Another component that gets brought up that I think is fair is to give Canelo the edge in chin and durability. Crawford is not going to be able to hurt Canelo. None of the fighters that Canelo has fought, besides, again, referring to something way when he was like a younger kid, Miguel Cotto's brother, no fighter has been able to hurt him up until this point. People that are certified bangers, that have knockouts on their record, have not been able to crack his chin. So I highly doubt that that'll be the case. When it comes to durability, though, we've seen Crawford take a hit, and, whether or not you guys want to count that Mean Machine knockdown, it looked like a knockdown from every angle. We've seen Crawford buzzed and buckled by a Gamboa. The fact that he might have been weight drained in those lower weight classes could play into the factor, but the truth of the matter is Canelo's going to hit 3 times, 4 times as hard as Gamboa, and if we've seen him hurt by that caliber of a fighter, we will definitely be able to see him be hurt by Canelo. Another reason is that Canelo's the A side. We all know, right, that in order to beat Canelo, you have to go in there and win every single round to get a split decision. I mean, even the great Mayweather was awarded a majority decision, right, with that one judge that scored the fight a draw or something crazy like that. So we know when you're fighting an A-side fighter like Canelo, you're going in with 3 rounds like already banked in for him. So that's one of those things where it's kind of like an unwritten rule kind of thing, but it's something that's frowned upon, but we also have to take that into consideration. So if the plan is to run and move around the ring and outbox Canelo, how will the judges perceive that? Canelo's pretty good about applying effective pressure. And so the fact that TImopthy Bradley thinks that Crawford could potentially escape a Las Vegas decision for Canelo, just sticking and moving, I don't think that's going to be the case. So body attack and inside game. So Crawford is actually super underrated when it comes to his inside game. I think that because of his wrestling experience, he's able to move around fighters and position them in ways that he sees best fit. But honestly, Canelo's been able to push guys that are 200 pounds around the ring. We saw him push around Berlanga. We saw him push around Munguia. We've seen him back Callum Smith and all these different fighters up all the time. And he's able to apply this constant pressure. And if there's one thing that Canelo's known for, it's a body attack. We all know that Crawford is going to have the slickness and the agility to move around most punches. But for the most part, the body is the easiest component to hit. And it's one of the things that Canelo specializes in, right? If Crawford is good at moving his head, yes, Canelo may not be able to land a punch, but those body punches eventually will wear Crawford down. With that being said, I'd also give the inside fight and, the body punches, I'd give that to Canelo. With all these points being mentioned, it almost sounds like I'm the complete opposite of Tim Bradley, where I think Canelo's just going to dominate Crawford. And while I used to think that before, I don't necessarily think that's the case. With all these things playing in Canelo's favor, I believe that Crawford is still skilled enough to survive. I don't think that it's in his nature. I think he's going to want to bang it out, and I think that's how the knockout would come should they fight. But I think that if Crawford decides to just accept the fact that he's not going to be able to handle the punishment, he could escape with a decision win for Canelo. And I think that's how this fight's going to end. It's probably going to be a unanimous decision for Canelo, 8 rounds to 4, 7 rounds to 5. Like, I can see Crawford having success early on in the fight, but I don't see him being able to keep that pace up forever, which is ironic because Canelo's the one with the stamina issues, but Crawford's going to be taking a lot of punishment in there. And whether the punches land on his arms or his hips or his sides, we all know that eventually Canelo's going to open him up. But with all that being said, I guess my question to Timothy Bradley would be, like, why the Canelo hate? It doesn't make sense. You don't have to talk down on Canelo to big up Crawford. Like, Crawford's still an all-time great. He's still one of the most versatile fighters in today's boxing. And honestly, it's been a pleasure watching him fight for the last few years. But, just because he's been great at these lower weight classes doesn't mean he's going to move up and fight another all-time great fighter and dominate him in the way that you think so. So it's kind of interesting, again, that, these biases come into play with everyone. But, if we just take a look at it from every single angle, there's honestly not a lot of ways that Crawford would win this fight. So with that being said, I'd like to hear what you guys think about this potential matchup. I would highly recommend you guys check out the last video I did on this topic. I went a lot more into detail with like the opposition and things like that. This was more of a response to Timothy Bradley and kind of like the rhetoric that he's been giving out as of late. With that being said, this is all fun talk. So if you guys don't agree with me, that's perfectly fine. Feel free to let me know what you agree with, what you disagree with. Thank you all again for tuning in. Peace.